Welcome to this episode of the ASCOR Explainer series. My name is Giorgia Monsignori, and I'm an analyst at the Transition Pathway Initiative Centre based at the London School of Economics. In today's episode, I'll walk you through just transition in the ASCOR framework. The ASCOR framework is built on three pillars that assess a different aspect of countries' climate performance. Each pillar covers relevant areas in line with its theme. So you see that just transition is located just under the second pillar on climate policies. If you're interested in further information on any of these areas, please take a look at the ASCOR framework, and you'll see that the methodology note is linked just below the table on this slide. So today's video structure will start with an introduction to just transition policy. We'll then look at how ASCOR specifically assesses just transition, and then finally, we'll see some results and emerging good practices from the 2024 assessment results. So to begin, just transition originally was a labor-focused concept. However, it has since expanded. Today, just transition is a process that aims to make the transition fair and inclusive for a range of stakeholders, including workers, communities, and marginalized groups. It's truly about minimizing impacts and maximizing the benefits of the transition, leaving no one behind, but especially those affected parties. So if you were to look at the focus on a labor demands, this could be upskilling the workforce and providing job opportunities, especially with this changing market of the transition. However, at the core, it's truly about enhancing the institutional capacity to ensure that there's this inclusive decision-making, which can help not only countries in managing the risks of the transition, but also harnessing the opportunities. So by involving these stakeholders at stages in the planning, whether that be workers or communities, it's ensuring that there's a targeted response in addressing the specific needs of different stakeholders. Other key elements that just transition touches on include addressing historical injustices, human rights violations, as well as loss and damage from climate change. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it's important to address the social impacts of the transition, and we aim to assess how countries are managing and planning for these risks, because this isn't only building public support, but it can also prevent the future cost delays related to the transition. This is also supported by the Paris Agreement, which calls for a just transition of the workforce. And as I mentioned, that can mean upskilling, retraining, but also creating decent work opportunities in new sectors. So if you're thinking about the workforce in fossil fuel sectors, for example, the transition will see that these jobs as gradually decreasing. So this is a critical focus to have as well for different countries. From the investor perspective, upholding such labor standards, but also human rights standards in line with climate commitments is a key priority. And then from the ASCOR perspective, and to conclude on this part, this whole area really encapsulates one of the main design principles of ASCOR, which is fairness. So moving on to how ASCOR specifically assesses a country on just transition, we'll firstly look for whether the country has ratified fundamental human, labor, and indigenous rights conventions. We only apply the Indigenous Rights Convention for countries who have evidence of indigenous communities within their territories. And this is also complemented with the quantitative metric on percentile of voice and accountability, which we source directly from the World Bank. We'll then assess if the country has an inclusive and institutionalized approach on just transition. This includes three elements. So the first one is social dialogue with workers, which the ILO defines through a tripartite mechanism, including employers, employees, and government representatives. The second criteria looks for engagement with at least three stakeholders, and the stakeholders could be academia, NGOs, women, youth, indigenous communities, and so forth. And finally, we look for a Just Transition Commission or an equivalent body which oversees the implementation of such an approach or the strategy. And then moving on, as I mentioned, that there's a focus on the workforce and labor market demands is important for the just transition. We identify whether the country has a green job strategy that identifies opportunities, risks, but also sets actions and policies to address this sort of employment-related analysis which has been conducted. And then finally, we assess whether a country has integrated just transition into its carbon pricing. This is usually in the form of the acknowledgement of these regressive impact or mechanisms such as revenue redistribution for low-income or vulnerable households. Our analysis in this area focuses on the action taken by countries to integrate just transition into their policymaking, and this is often differing according to country needs and priorities and for their tailored actions towards the affected stakeholders. However, across all countries, we're generally looking for engagement strategies, consultation processes, and this is because it's a key action to ensure that the participation and inclusion of all stakeholders is incorporated. But it's also encouraging that the national action has a more targeted and efficient approach to just transition, which is something we keep coming back to. Although we assess all countries on just transition indicators and metrics, we exempt low-income countries from integrating just transition into their carbon pricing systems to align with the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities. But this is also in line with our assessments in the carbon pricing area as well as a part of our framework. Regarding sources and evidence, we look at legislative and executive documents, UNFCCC submissions, UN data, and ILO data. And then, as I had mentioned, we use World Bank data for the quantitative metric. As you see on the screen, on the left, you see the indicators we assess, and on the right, the results. And you'll see that the lowest performing area or indicator in this area is the inclusive and institutionalized approach on just transition. It's in fact still an emerging concept, and we haven't identified a blueprint that countries are following in suit. Then the best performing indicator here you'll see is that 77% of countries are integrating just transition into their carbon pricing systems. For a deeper dive, I will now show you some country cases with some good practices which highlight emerging good practices in this area. So when we talk about inclusive and institutionalized just transition approaches, Spain really stands out. They have a just transition strategy which is required to be updated every 5 years according to their climate law. But it also has a monitoring and reporting mechanism for the policy at the midpoint of every 5 years, and this is coordinated by their Just Transition Commission or ITJ Advisory Board. For green job strategies, we've seen that Austria's Just Transition Action Plan on Training and Reskilling is well developed, as it sets short, medium, and long-term actions to address the needs of not only the current employees, but also the future employees. And then finally, with regards to regressive impacts of carbon pricing systems, European Union member states, as a part of the EU emission trading system, and because the regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council establishing a social climate fund requires a part of the revenues generated by the emission trading system to be used to support vulnerable households through this climate fund. So this is a good institutionalized practice to ensure that the regressive impacts are addressed. that wraps up our overview of Just Transition. If you would like to learn more about the ASCOR or explore the episodes of ASCOR Explainer series, please visit our website. Thank you for watching.